Okay, should be online now.
Okay, welcome everyone to the Digital History Seminar. It's my pleasure this evening to introduce Dr. Stephen Rose, who's a reader in the Department of Music at Royal Holloway, University of London. Stephen's specialism is in music between 1500 and 1750, and he's speaking tonight on the Big Data History of Music project. Just for the awareness of those in the room, we are streaming live online. So when we do come to Q&A at the end, just be aware that you want to ask questions which you're happy to be archived in some form online afterwards. And I'll hand over to Steve.
Thank you very much for the invitation. So today I want to introduce, as James said, this project called the Big Data History of Music, which is a collaboration between Royal Holloway and the British Library. It was one of the small projects funded by the RHUL as part of its strand of investigating big data in the humanities. So I want to discuss today how this project might lead to new perspectives in writing music history, and in turn it might perhaps lead to an improved dialogue between music historians and cultural historians more widely. So I'll start off by giving some background information about trends in the study of music history and about big data in music. Then I'll talk about some of the technical aspects of the project, in which we assembled combined library catalogue and bibliographical records, about 2 million records in it as big data, and then started to analyse them. And then I'll give some case studies of how analysing this data can maybe open some new large-scale perspectives on music history. So to start with, some background on trends in music history, and this is a very simplified account, but I thought it might be useful for you who are probably coming from the historian's standpoint. Music history or historical musicology as a discipline is something of a hybrid, and it tends to draw quite eclectically on ideas and methods from other disciplines such as arts history, book history, and cultural history. However, there are, I think, at least two major trends in the writing of music history. And one of these is source studies, studies of individual manuscripts or printed editions, sometimes drawing on paleographic methods to interrogate the handwriting or the notational characteristics. Sometimes drawing on methods of book historians to ask how the format of the source influences how it would have been used. Sometimes using sources to reconstruct how composers might have drafted and revised their music, as with Rebecca Harrison's book, Their Musical Creativity in Restoration England. So that's one trend in music history. And another trend explores the social or intellectual contexts of particular musical works. And here's a selection of recent books on works by Bach. So one on the left, John Butt's study of Bach's St. Matthew Passion relates it to changing notions of the self in the early 18th century. The book in the middle, Eric Chaffe's book contextualizes the St. John Passion with Lutheran theology. And then the book on the right looks at the Bach's B minor Mass in relation to the worlds of its early performers. So both of these strands of music history tend to focus a lot on individual musical works, particularly those by composers who have been canonized over the centuries as worthy of study or performance. So it's no coincidence my previous slides were, well, I had one slide with books about Purcell, probably the most regularly performed and canonized composer of the late 17th century, and here we have a clutch of books on Bach, maybe the most canonized composer of the early 18th century. Yet hundreds of musical figures outside this canon are marginalized and relatively rarely studied. So for every 20 books on Bach, you might have one on Telemann, who was Bach's much more famous contemporary, famous in the 18th century, and barely any research on other contemporaries of Bach, such as Graupner and Sturzel. So our sort of current aesthetic and musical preferences for which pieces of music we like to listen to today still very much dominate research, historical research into the music of previous centuries. So you could say music history suffers from the same problems that Franco Moretti saw in studies of the 19th century novel, and he criticized literary historians for focusing on a handful of canonized works and subjecting those works to close reading. And his answer in his books, Graphs, Maps and Trees, was this idea of distant reading, where he investigates not the contents of individual novels, but instead he looks at the bibliographical data about those novels and tries then to give an overview, and maybe a rather simplistic overview, of the development of a genre in response to historical and social and political factors. So this is one chart from his book where he shows how in the 1780s in France, you have a revolution and then you have an immediate slump in the number of novels being produced. And then about 10 years later, a huge upsurge, almost as if the ideas unleashed by the revolution take a while to percolate into literature. And a similar graph for Italy in the 1840s and the sort of political instability in Milan then. And he's looked at what he calls the great unread authors. How can he get a grip on these novelists of the 19th century, for instance, by charting the lifespan of different genres of the novel, so how each genre, the sentimental or the Gothic novel, was in favour for about 25 or 30 years, and then fashion moves on to another genre. Now, you probably also already know that Moretti's work is controversial, particularly he tends to claim that his quantitative research can provide data that is ideally independent of interpretation. And that seems to be a rather naive claim, which I certainly wouldn't agree with. But I think what is interesting about his approach, and what is quite inspirational if you study music history, is this idea that by looking at the great unread authors, or maybe the great unheard composers, we can shake music history or literary history from its fixation of the canon, and we can put the canon into context and ask how representative it is. So that was something of the aim, or one of the aims behind this idea of approaching music history through big data rather than through looking at a few canonized pieces of music. Let me now give you some examples of big data within the study of music. So big data has been defined as data that exists in large quantities, that has a lot of variety about it, or that has a high velocity because more data is being added very rapidly. And so some examples in music where you have exceedingly large data sets, which are also often have a lot of variety to them. One example are machine readable scores. Optical music recognition is still in its infancy and still doesn't work very well. It probably has an accuracy rate of about 70% on a really good day, because music notation just has so many details which are hard to recognize. All the same, data sets are being built up of machine readable scores, and recently this Ngram viewer called Peach Notes has been developed, which looks at a range of machine readable scores, and you can then search it for a melodic motif which you can enter on a little keyboard, and it will then search for that across a huge range of music, from Beethoven to 20th century stuff. Another area of big data in music is data sets made up from audio files or audio libraries. And audio files are always very large files in size, and when you can analyze them, you basically have a kind of visualization of the sound waves, and you can analyze them in various ways. And this has been done by another of the big data projects that the RHUL funded. This was called the Digital Music Lab, and they did this thing called a sort of chord visualizer, which looked at common chord patterns in different genres of music, so blues, jazz, how different chords might be connected. Then finally, the area that my project was looking at, which is the metadata about music publications and music manuscripts, so the library catalogue descriptions and bibliographical records that already exist. How can we take these and start to analyse them? So in this project, a big data history of music, we were trying to unlock the vast amount of bibliographical data held by research libraries for music researchers to analyse. And then we were seeing if this data can be interrogated in ways that challenge those traditional narratives of music history, often fixated on great composers or canonized musical works. And then more specifically, we had these objectives, which were to clean and enhance 2 bibliographical data sets of the British Library, and then to pilot big data research techniques on these and 5 other data sets. And then finally, we made the British Library data sets publicly available for download. So let me now give you a bit more detail about the project, more technical detail about the data sets we were using. We were using 7 data sets, and I'll just introduce them very quickly. The first 3 on this list are created by an international organisation called RHUL, the Répertoire International des Sources Musicales, which has been collecting printed and manuscript music and details of the bibliographical descriptions of those sources from libraries across the world since the 1950s. And we used 3 RHUL data sets. First of all, RHUL A1, which lists works containing music by a single composer. RHUL B1, which contains anthologies, so books containing music by more than one composer. And also RHUL A2, which lists manuscripts copied between 1600 and about 1850. And between them, those 3 RHUL data sets contain over 1 million records. So by the standards of the humanities, that is fairly big data, although scientists would disagree with me. Now, when we started the project about 18 months ago, a lot of this RHUL data was still actually only available in the hard copy volumes. And maybe encouraged by projects such as this one, more of this data has been now migrating online through RHUL, which is actually based in Frankfurt. And actually, about a few weeks ago, they put all of the RHUL A1 data online, and previously we had sort of been given a sneak preview of it to work with, but it's now available as open data, although some of it is still not fully online. So that was, RHUL has a huge geographic scope. It has collected data from libraries across the world, although it's strongest in coverage for sort of English-speaking and German-speaking countries. There's less sort of French and Italian contributions to it. But it is restricted in terms of its chronological scope. The records only go up to music created or copied around 1850. So we wanted to look at music history over a longer time frame, and for this we looked at some of the British Library catalogue records, particularly the 4th one on this list, which is the British Library's catalogue of printed music. You can see that has in itself about 1 million records. So it includes music published between 1500 and the present day. And of course, because the BL is a legal deposit library, it has received 1 copy of every piece of music published in the British Isles. So that is a truly representative and comprehensive data set of British publications. The coverage of material from overseas is obviously very good, but it's less comprehensive. And just within that catalogue of printed music, the 20th century music publications alone contain works by more than 100,000 composers, and many of those just had sort of 1 work to their name, and often these are long forgotten composers, so you could sort of see them as being the great unheard, to borrow that sort of term or adapt that term of Franco Moretti's. And we also looked at some of the British Library catalogues of manuscript music, some of which are still not online, and as part of the project we spent some time cleaning and upgrading these catalogues. So in terms of a number of records, over 2 million records within these 7 data sets, that is a relatively high volume of data. And there was also a lot of variety in the data, which is another characteristic of big data. To simplify, I mean, these are the main facets or types of data within the 6 data sets: the names of composers, the titles of musical works, the places where they were published or copied, time or date of copying, the subjects or musical genres, and the printers or publishers. And sometimes there would be other facets of the data depending on how comprehensive the records, the cataloguing records are. But what then caused the challenge is that these facets are captured to a very inconsistent level in each of the data sets. So here were the main data sets we were working with, and you can see, although almost all of them record the name of the composer, there's a lot of inconsistency in other areas. So for instance, the title of musical works or musical compositions is not really recorded in the data sets relating to printed music, which are the ones shaded in the darker grey at the top. Sometimes they might be. So you always have that inconsistency in these data sets that have been built up by library cataloguers over sort of decades of work. On the other hand, country or city of origin, this information is almost always present for printed music. So you can see, again, the Y's, yeses indicating that was present in the top 3 data sets, but hardly at all for the manuscript ones. Even though it is often, you can often say for a manuscript that at least the likely country of its copying by looking at some paper type and things like that. So the data sets were very variable, and one of the aims of our clean work on them was to try and create a little bit more uniformity, although obviously within a tiny project and within a few months there's a restriction to what you can do with when you have over 2 million records. So let me now talk a little bit more about how the data was transformed out of library catalogues and made a bit easier to analyse. In the library catalogues, whether held by RHUL or by the British Library, the data was in Mark 21, the format for library catalogue records. And before it could be analysed, we needed to transfer it into a spreadsheet format, more like that. And to do this, we used a tool called Mark Edit, which is a kind of open source tool. And this transforms the library catalogue records into tab separated files, which then can be opened in a variety of software, whether it's Excel for someone who's not a great specialist, or specialist statistical software. And as part of Mark Edit, you can choose which of the mark fields you export into your new tab separated file. So you don't have to export some of the system numbers and things which are just relevant to the library system. So that was quite useful already in selecting what might be more useful for analysis. However, once we got the data into tab separated or comma separated files, we were faced with a lot of diversity, reflecting the fact that this data had been assembled by cataloguers and bibliographers over decades, if not centuries, often to a range of different cataloguing standards. And this slide just shows some of the different ways in which a date containing the year 1825 might be recorded. Now, obviously, some of those different formats are actually really important in telling you different cataloguing information. In the first one, which is an 1825 watermark. If it's in square brackets, it's a conjectural date, or it's a range of dates. So you don't want to lose those nuances that the original cataloguers put into the data. But if you are wanting to sort it by date, you have to create some extra columns in your file to show that it might belong to this year, 1825, or to a decade, or even to a century, really depending on what the purposes of your analysis are. And to do this, this cleaning or this adding of additional columns to the data, we used a tool called Open Refine, which I think started off as a sort of Google offshoot, Google Refine, and now is open source software for dealing with messy data, identifying and correcting inconsistencies across a large batch. So you filter the data to find examples of a particular term, and then you can clean that term across wherever it occurs. But we tried to retain alongside our clean data the original data, because it still might tell us something about what the original cataloger was trying to say in their description of the musical source, and we didn't want to obliterate that. And of course, it's really important to be aware of the limits of the original cataloguing or bibliographic data, which often contain relics of cataloguing practices. For instance, much printed music of the 18th and 19th century is undated, so catalogers have to put a conjectural date on it. So they normally go for a round date of 1830, 1840, 1850. So if you take those dates literally and did a year-by-year chart of when Handel's music was published, you get these sparks every 10 years or so. You can see there's a big one in 1760, big one in 1790. So you have to be very sensitive to the provenance of the data, and in a case like this, it would be much better to plot these Handel publications on a decade-by-decade basis rather than a year-by-year basis. And this is one way where, we really need to understand the provenance of the data, and Franco Moretti's idea that data can be independent of interpretation, I think is very idealistic and problematic when you're confronted with the data that we normally have to use. So let me now pop onto some case studies of how we started to analyse this data. And I'm going to quickly talk about 3 case studies. The first case study is looking at long-term trends in the rise and fall of music publishing across the 16th and 17th centuries, slightly inspired by Joe Gouldy and David Armitage's History Manifesto, where it's called to sort of look at things on long-term timescales. Then I'll talk about a case study about a particular composer, the 16th century Catholic composer Palestrina, and then finally one about the rise of music with national flavours or ethnic flavours in the 19th century. So to start off with, first case study about the rise and fall of music printing in the 16th and 17th centuries. So this was using data from the RHUL data sets of printed music, which are fairly comprehensive. Maybe they contain about 90% of music surviving, printed music that survives today, and chronologically accurate, as printed music in the 16th and 17th century normally had the year of publication on the title page, so you can date things to a particular year, unlike those Handel publications I showed a moment ago. So viewed decade by decade, this data shows a steady rise of music publishing through the 16th century. Interesting little plateau in the 1570s, which I'll come back to, and up to a peak in the 1610s when about 1,800 books of printed music have been issued every decade. And then we have a very sharp decline in the 1630s, and then music printing never really recovers to its previous levels. It remains roughly at the level of about 800 books a decade. And in a moment, I'm going to try and see what some of the reasons for this interesting charts might be. But first of all, just a way of sort of giving a bit more nuance to this data, we can divide it between single composer prints, so those containing music just by one composer, versus anthologies. And so the anthologies are shown in the blue colour. And what's interesting is that anthologies were quite dominant in the early years of music printing, maybe because at this time music printing was being led by editors and publishers rather than the musicians themselves. So musicians didn't really see it as a major source of income, and instead editors would collect together sort of music in an anthology, a bit like these by Petrucci, the first specialist and systematic music printer. And this is one of his very first items of printed music from 1501. There's no names of the composer on this. It's just an anthology of various selected pieces with no indication of composers given on the title page. So these anthologies are important up to the 1540s, and then you can see all the growth in music printing then happens in books of music which just contain the music of one composer. And the number of anthologies remains fairly static, it's about 200 a decade. And for me, this suggests that from the 1550s, composers took much more initiative in publishing their own works. And you start to get books like this. This is a magnum opus musicum, the works of the Munich court composer Orlando de Lassus. And you can see how the composer has been monumentalized. His name is in big letters at the top, bigger than the name of his patron, Ferdinand of Bavaria, surrounded in this triumphal arch. So you can see here a sudden emphasis on the composer as an author who's been monumentalized. And I think that increasing importance of the individual composer is brought out a little bit in that statistical analysis. Now, this isn't new to present charts of the output of music printing. Obviously, people have been doing this in books for a while, doing static charts of the output. I tried to do some of this in my PhD 15 years ago, very laboriously counting things up basically by hand and feeding them into Excel in those days. I think the advantage of a digital analysis is that you can change the focus of the analysis so easily. So you can see the big trends here, decade by decade trends, and then you can zoom in and look at it by year, and you can suddenly see that it's a much spikier picture, and there's, for instance, that plateau in the 1570s. You can now see that there are certain years, such as 1577, which are exceptionally low, 1576 or 1571, and again 1631. So you can start to get into the kind of detail, the granular detail of the data, and if you can then start to break it down by individual cities, and you can then see that, for instance, that plateau in the 1570s, it's not caused, so much by a sort of uniform decline, but it's very much a decline in Venice, which is the purple, and you can see it going down first of all in 1571, and then in 1576 and 1577, very sharp decline, and again in 1630. So you can start to see how the overall European trend is very much shaped by what's going on in one particular place, Venice, and then that then leads you into what was happening economically or socially in Venice in those years. And of course, in 1571, it was the height of the Venetian-Turkish war leading to the Battle of Lepanto, and then in 1576 and 1577 it was the plague, which wiped out about 30% of the Venetian population. So you can start to see how the events in one city affected cultural production, and then had an impact on the whole of Europe, because Venice was such a centre for music which would be sent out across all of Europe. And you can then also look at individual books. For instance, although music printing generally declined so much in 1571, and in general, the more light-hearted music was very little of it was printed in 1571. A few of these books were still printed in 1571. So this can lead you back to the individual sources, and you can think, well, why was it that Giuseppe Policretto managed to get his Neapolitan canzonettas published in 1571, whereas other composers of light music, this was seen as being economically unjustifiable or unsuitable in a time of war. So going then back to this overall graph of the rise and fall of music printing, another big decline is in the 1630s. And again, that partly reflects calamities in Venice, another plague outbreak in the early 1630s, an economic crisis that was causing the price of paper to increase. There were also musical changes, meaning that new musical styles didn't fit the old printing formats as well. It's also tempting to relate it to Braudel's observation about the lifespan of early modern industries, typically having a sharp rise followed by an abrupt fall. And that seems to be exactly the case with music printing. It soars in the mid-16th century and then falls in the mid-17th century. And it doesn't just decline in the 17th century. Music printing also fragments geographically, and we were able to see this very strongly again in our analysis, that music printing centres were typically issuing far fewer books in the 17th century, catering for much smaller, much more regional markets. So in the 16th century, this is the 1570s, a sort of sample decade, these are the top 10 centres in terms of the amount of music being published. And you can see that Venice, in the sort of slightly purpley violet shade, dominates, and Paris and Nuremberg in the second and third place are really overshadowed by the dominance of Venice. And you have maybe about 20 centres across the whole of Europe where music is being printed. And then into the 17th century, you have an increase in the number of centres where music is being printed, but the number of books being printed is declining, and Venice is losing its dominance. And there's a move to northern centres, particularly along the North Sea and the Baltic, that seems to correspond to the shift of industrial production away from Spain and Italy up to places like the Netherlands, which can focus more on the Atlantic economy. And so if we now go to the music printing centres in the 1690s, you can see that no longer does one city dominate in the way that it had done in the 16th century. In fact, Venice, in the sort of beige shade on the right, is maybe the fourth most important centre now. And now it is London and Amsterdam, sort of representatives of the new Atlantic-facing economy that dominate, with Bologna and Paris also important. But you can see there's a much more of a levelling and fragmentation. So there are now several centres specialising in music, and no longer is it just the skills of the Venetian printers and the contacts of the Venetian economy, meaning that music printing is focused in one place. So it was very interesting to be able to see these trends, look at hundreds and thousands of bibliographical records and see these overall trends, which we had suspected they existed, but it was impossible to quantify and visualize them before doing this kind of work. So that's my first case study. My second case study, I thought it'd be interesting to give you an example of how we can look at the works of a particular composer. And I've chosen here Palestrina, who was a musician working in Rome at the Sistine Chapel in the late 16th century, very closely associated with Catholic renewal and the Council of Trent. This is the image from his first book of masses. Palestrina is kneeling, presenting his book of masses to Pope Julius III. So music historians have often sort of suggested that Palestrina is this sort of archetypal Catholic figure. And I thought it would be interesting to see from a bibliographical data, is Palestrina's music mainly circulating in Catholic areas, or does it actually spread to Protestant areas as well? Is there cultural exchange of musicians so closely associated with the sort of counter-Reformation spirituality? So we started to do some network diagrams of the different places in which Palestrina's music was published. And not surprisingly, the biggest centre of where his music was published was Venice. We've already seen the dominance of Venice. And that was mainly music during his lifetime in the 1590s and the 1570s and the 1580s. But there's two sort of in second place, equal second place, were two very strongly Catholic centres, Rome and Antwerp. Antwerp having been, I think, re-Catholicized in about 1579. And what's interesting here in these places, Palestrina's music has a much Palestrina's music has a much longer lifespan. It's still being printed in Rome in the 1680s, almost a century after he's died. It has a real longevity there. Even in Antwerp, it's still being printed in the 1640s, 1630s. That was very unusual for music in the 16th and 17th century to be printed after the composer had dies. Generally, music, new music was seen as a desirable thing. And maybe this lingering publication of music, Palestrina's music in Catholic centres, was to do with this myth which was being circulated by music historians as early as the 1600s, such as this Italian writer Agazzari, who claimed that music would have nearly been banished by the Council of Trent had not Palestrina found the remedy, showing that the fault and error lay not with music, but with the composers, and composing in confirmation of this a mass entitled Missa Papae Marcelli. Now, that story is a myth. There's no historical evidence that is true, but it's clearly a myth that then helped this dissemination of his music and strengthened that association of his music with Tridentine Catholicism. So the interesting question is the peripheral locations that Palestrina's music was reached, particularly the Protestant locations. So some of these smaller dots on the page. So it does reach some Counter-Reformation centres, such as Dillingen in Germany, which had a Jesuit university in Milan, which was a centre of Counter-Reformation spirituality. But particularly interesting is this periphery, particularly Protestant locations. I mean, not all of them Protestant locations, but Nuremberg, London, Strasbourg, Leipzig. But it's already in the 1580s. Palestrina's music is reaching these places in small quantities. And then that seeing this kind of visualization helps you focus on those peripheral cases and ask, what was it about that particular piece of music that appealed to Protestant London in the 1580s, which in general was a fairly hostile place for overtly Catholic things. And we find that it was actually Palestrina's secular music, his madrigals rather than his church music. And even then, it was Englished in these Protestant peripheries. It was giving you English texts. So very interesting to be able to start with a network diagram, and then it can take you to sort of close readings beloved of historical musicologists of particular pieces of music. I'll pop now onto my last case study, which was looking at 19th century trends, particularly the rise of music that was marketed as having a particular ethnic or national flavour. And we did a case study of the rise of music that described itself as Scottish. Now, obviously, this might not be music actually by Scottish composers, but it's music that says in some way in the title that it is a Scots song, it is Schottischer, it is an ACOS in whatever language. And this is data taken from the British Library's catalogue of printed music. And as I mentioned earlier, the dating of printed music in this period is very approximate. And a lot of these Scots publications lack dates and have had to be assigned to a decade by the British Library's cataloguers over the generations as they have catalogued this material. So you have to take all the dates with a slight pinch of salt, but there is a definite trend, an interesting trend of an increase and then a sudden fall and then another increase in this. And it was interesting to try and relate this to the changing political relationship between Scotland and England in the 18th and 19th century. So you can see that the first music that mentions of being Scottish in some ways from the 1680s onwards, and it remains at a fairly low level until the 1760s. And then diving into the data, we could see that a lot of these were often songs from sort of London popular music or London stage songs in which kind of stock Scottish figures were presented and singing about slightly stereotyped Scottish topics like Pretty Kate of Edinburgh, as in this song supposedly sung before the king, probably Charles II at Windsor. But then in the 1770s, the number suddenly started to increase, and this increase continued. And I think one reason for this rise was in James Macpherson's publication of his so-called Ossian ballads, which were these ballads published in the 1760s which had supposedly he had recovered from an ancient bard, and they became very popular, and they sort of fed into this surge of interest in the primitive nobility of ancient peoples, even though the whole thing was a forgery. So sure enough, by the 1780s and 1790s, we start to see, again, sort of diving then into the data, British Library data, you started to see these Ossian settings. So this one addressed to the sun from a poem of Ossian, set to music, even though it's again something in London, and the musical styles probably don't show anything Scottish about them, but it's giving this idea of a sort of kind of projection of a Scottish or mythologically ancient Pictish identity. And another factor was, of course, the writings of Walter Scott, which were inspiring musical settings at this time. One interesting thing then to ask was, why did the number of Scottish publications, Scottish music publications, or Scottish music decline so sharply in the 1830s? Is this just a freak of the cataloguing, that the cataloguers were reluctant to assign many publications to that decade? Or is it because the craze for Ossian's poetry and for Walter Scott was subsiding? Is it also that there was a strengthening sense of political union that made it less necessary for English publishers to stereotype Scottishness in music? Those are various hypotheses that we came up with and haven't sort of got any further with. But what is clear is that the number starts to pick up again in the 1840s and then starts to climb slightly erratically. And the 1840s is, of course, the decade when Queen Victoria makes her first visit to Scotland, 1842 to be precise. And Prince Albert gives his approval to the Scottish scenery, says it's very German looking. And from that point onwards, again, diving into the data for the individual publications, we started to see a huge number of publications which were referring explicitly to Queen Victoria's journeys to Scotland, Scotia's welcome to Victoria, or pieces of music actually celebrating Balmoral, the royal residence. And I could give you many more examples, but I'm going to run out of time. But as I'm sure many of you are aware, historians such as Hugh Trevor Roper very famously showed that aspects of Highland culture, such as the tartan, the kilt and bagpipes, were largely inventions of the late 18th and early 19th century. And our look at the bibliographical data for music of this period suggests that a similar process was happening in music. This kind of Scottishness is being invented in music, often by English, London-based composers and London music publishers who are sort of saying this is this music is representative in some way of Scotland. For instance, Henry Bishop was an English composer and not a Scottish one. So taking this data-driven quantitative approach can help us chart this musical invention of supposed Scottish traditions. So I'll just give a few quick conclusions to finish with. Doing this big data of history of music project showed that this kind of work gives challenges, but also opportunities for music historians, and maybe then also for cultural historians as well. And my discipline is still very much focused on small-scale case studies, doing kind of micro-history of particular musical works. And it was quite refreshing to take this big sweep approach to see how an individual manuscript and individual musical work might relate to wider trends. And because so many of those wider trends are often driven by social or economic factors, as with that case study on the rise and fall of music printing, it's very helpful, I think, to see how music was so strongly affected by things like war or plague in Venice. And I hope seeing that sort of work will help music historians come more into an interdisciplinary dialogue with other subdisciplines of history. Earlier on, I quoted Franco Moretti's view that data should ideally be independent of interpretations. And I hope I've shown that that sort of view is hopelessly naive. But to understand this kind of data, you need to know about the assumptions and the scholarly horizons of the cataloguers who contributed to these data sets, such as RISM and British Library catalogues. And these were assembled over many decades, often to changing standards. And we need to understand the provenance of the data as we analyse it. So I don't think this kind of data analysis can supplant older methods of source work or older styles of musicological study which focus on particular musical works. But I hope that the two techniques can be used symbiotically, but you can manipulate and visualize the data to see trends that you're not going to see from the individual manuscript or printed sources. But then doing these kind of visualizations and these analyses hopefully will send people with renewed interest back to the individual sources, back to find things of interest. And maybe that's a sort of manifesto more generally that historians will agree with. And just to finish, I ought to give you the web address where you can download the open data for the British Library's catalogue of printed music and catalogue of manuscript music if you want to look at that. So it's on the same part of the British Library's website where the British National Bibliography can be downloaded. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'm going to take chair's privilege and ask this question before I open up to everyone else. What I really liked about your talk was that you managed to focus on the fact that you use the bibliographic data to sort of, on one hand, test suspicions, to back up, well, I guess test assumptions, not test suspicions, but test assumptions, back up some suspicions, and indeed open up new lines of inquiry. And I got the sense from you, I guess, that actually the opening up new lines of inquiry bit actually was quite fruitful. So I guess one of the common modes of using a large amount of data in sort of historical research has been in recent years. There's a lot of work that's gone well. We've kind of found something that we kind of suspected, and that is still useful. But it seems you actually also managed to do some work that went a little bit beyond that. And I was just intrigued because I know the period quite well, but I don't know the history of music particularly well. Whether that actually backs up into your discipline, I guess in more detail, more depth, whether you're going to your sort of your peers and colleagues in the field and they're saying, yeah, it's kind of interesting thing that this data is actually picking out, and whether obviously you do hope that people will follow up from there, but whether you kind of you're feeling that there are genuinely some angles of attack that colleagues can see.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's often you do have a bit of an inkling that this would be an interesting area, because that's what sort of leads you then to focus on that bit of data. From the example of the music printing, and sort of people knew that there was less music being printed in the 17th century compared to the 16th century, but I don't think anyone had really been able to see how events in Venice were so pivotal, that almost the economic microscale then has this ripple effect on the whole of Europe, and that was quite surprising for me. I have to say we slightly struggled with that data because we first produced a graph which actually showed a fall of music printing in the 1570s, which was really interesting. When we checked that we weren't double counting, and we were double counting some things because the different data sets we were using, some of them, they weren't completely mutually exclusive, so we had to eliminate that double counting. And it would have been even more exciting if there had actually been a decline in the 1570s, and what it came out with was a plateau in 1570s. But that was still, I think, quite exciting for people. But the one that has excited people has been the Scottish case study, and we showed it to some people working at sort of places in Glasgow, some of whom have done PhDs on kind of Scottish music, or this sort of kind of idea of Scottish music, and they were quite surprised to see that chart and to see how rapidly it took off and then it declines, and it got them thinking in I think some new ways about their work. But it was also very interesting to have their views on that statistical approach. They had done PhDs, for instance, looking at a particular collection of Scotch songs, so they had a very close reading perspective. and it was quite interesting to sort of bring that together with a bigger picture.
What did Nicholas Sturgeon say when something like
No, it wasn't Nicola, unfortunately. But,
Questions?
Yeah, how many people were involved in this project?
So it was I was principal investigator and co-investigator at the British Library was Sandra Tuppen. So it lasted 15 months, and in the first 15 months, in the first 6 or 7 months, we had a team of about 12 very part-time research assistants, some of whom were kind of library cataloguers at the British Library, and some were music postgraduates, and they were doing the data cleaning work, often, sort of maybe half a day a week, fitting it around their existing commitments. And then in the second half of the project, we had one half-time postdoctoral research assistant to do some of the more sort of data crunching and work with the big data sets. So it was done on really on a shoestring and very tight budget. And in fact, one of the reasons we did it with a lot of people working 4 hours a week is that actually if you hire hourly paid research assistants, you don't have to pay the overheads, so you get a lot more research assistants for your money. Although that's not to advocate this as a way of working, but the AHRC had sort of imposed these budget limits on the projects.
How did you manage the quality then coming out of those people? Because I mean, as someone who cleans data myself, I know if I'm hungry or if it's Thursday, I do it differently than if I'm not hungry or it's Tuesday. So you've got like a bunch of different people,
yes,
all over the place, got their own ideas of what you're looking for. So
yes.
How did you actually manage that?
So they all did a bit of training with Sandra Tuppen, and we decided to focus them on particular areas that we thought needed cleaning. And one area was to upgrade all the British Library's records for 16th century printed music so they had the same level of detail, because some of them had huge amounts of detail down to sort of inventories of the contents of the book, and some of them had basically the title and the date and nothing else. So that was what we used for music postgraduates for, to basically do re-cataloguing work on those books. And they were so they had basically a template of this is the level of detail you should be working to, and they tried where possible to kind of, obviously sometimes you can't get that detail from the book, but that was more cataloguing work than actual data cleaning. The other work was being done by librarians and curators at the British Library. So again, they were working to instructions given by Sandra, and they were working on data structuring. So rather like what you were talking about when we were talking over tea earlier, that data gained from OCR'd hard copy catalogues and structuring that data into spreadsheet forms and cleaning it by providing standard authority controlled sort of names of composers and works. But it helped that because they were all already trained librarians, they already had an idea of sort of common standards, and they were all working to sort of British Library cataloguing and metadata expectations.
Can I follow up on the spreadsheet element of it? Because I think that, I mean, James tweeted about this, and I know you can't see the tweets necessarily, but James tweeted about this going through saying, you just used Excel and OpenRefine, and isn't that just beautifully simple and wonderful? And I think if you walked into a room full of historians and said, I'm this great digital person, I'm going to use Excel, they would think that was too simple. But I think what you're saying should be simple.
Well, obviously Excel and OpenRefine can't cope with very huge data sets, but I think it was important that the people involved in this project were not heavily techie people, and Excel I think worked perfectly fine for the. Let me see if I can show you it. Worked fine. I've been doing stupid university administration recently in Excel, so it's all got it's not coming up to hand. But Excel worked fine actually for manipulating the RHUL data sets with about up to I think 200,000 records. OpenRefine does struggle with bigger collections of material, but we did a data exploration day at the British Library in March, and we found the people attending that were really belonged to two strands. Either they were people who hadn't done much of this work before, and Excel was really, they didn't want to go further with Excel than Excel, and it would have been intimidating to say you need specialist statistical software. And on the other hand, there were people there using sort of R project statistical software and Gephi and tools like that for visualization. So I was going to show you some examples of both their specialist visualization, if I can find them. Let me, sorry. So, yes, you can work with this data using Gephi, and this was one visualization. This was a visualization of the British Library's entire catalogue of printed music using Gephi, which took about 24 hours to be done. It was done by Ben Fields, who works in computer science at Goldsmiths. And yeah, I mean, his chart, which looks strangely like a flower blooming, actually shows relations where a piece of music has two or more author names or authority names. It's just trying to show a network of those, and yeah, figures on the periphery don't have many connections. Figures right at the center, like Bach, have many connections. So that was a very specialist kind of work, or that was one done in the R project, looking at changing patterns of piano publications. And that's a visualization. I'm not sure what Marnix was using there, but looking at relationships, a network diagram, and looking at relationships between 16th century music printers. So data you can work as a sort of specialist level, but we thought it important not to kind of alienate people and make people think that you need a lot of specialist expertise, and that you can get into this data with fairly simple. And I was going to show you an Excel. So this is an Excel spreadsheet showing all the RHUL data up to 1699. It's only about 5 megabytes, and yet so you start with a master sheet in which you have all the bibliographic records, and it's really good to be able to move between that, and we've got them geocoded, so you can start to play with this, and then you can just start playing with this in various different ways. I mean, these are some of the visual. I showed some of these, but Excel is so user friendly, and it seemed to work fine with up to. Let me find out how many records are in this. Okay, it's only got about 16,300. I'm not sure why I mentioned hundreds of thousands earlier. But I think for someone who's not, a very high level of kind of technical expertise, it's quite reassuring that you can do some of these things in
You're
Excel.
saying that almost as if you're apologizing for it. And I mean, I think my understanding of James is, I think he was probably thinking that as more of something to be admired, that you're not using things that are unnecessarily complicated. Why use a multi-tool if you just need a piece of paper? Is that kind of...
Yeah, well, I think it can't do all the things that sort of the R project for statistical computing could, but but it can, if
But you
you're,
can store the data when
you can
you put it into the art
Yes.
project to do the
Yes.
next stage. And it's much easier it's much more sustainable to share that
yes,
than it is to share a SQL database, right?
yes,
Because everybody can open that.
yes. And I think this was really important also with the AHRC's agenda of, making research accessible, making, giving research impact and outreach. But I didn't want this to be just for kind of the most technically literate or technologically literate, but hopefully also useful for for instance, maybe someone who's working as a librarian, as a small specialist music archive or a music museum or something like that, that they can maybe play around with some of this data and then use it to contextualize their holdings or their come up with ideas for an exhibition or something.
Impressive, I think.
Thank you.
I'll follow that by saying that, I mean, one of the things that I just really like about this project is that, you have released the data obviously openly. And then it is both in RDF XML, which some people will want to query things in RDF XML, and there are benefits to that in that it can show multiple locations where something is published, it can show multiple composers, that kind of thing, if such a things exist. And it can show better, I guess, the multiple datings that you do get at some of the
Yes.
just because the very nature of library catalogues, and it therefore exposes the fact that library catalogues aren't canonical things, but rather are things created by people.
Yes.
Over long periods of time and different standards. But then also that, of course, that there is this just comma separate. I think it is a CSV file. Isn't it? It's a simple file which you can open in Excel and you can
Yes.
manipulate and query, which is brilliant. And I guess the thing that really opens up is that data then being combined with other data that's equally simply created, equally simply described, because you haven't got that many fields. It's not overly verbose. You can start working with the data. I guess I was thinking when you had your graph about Scottish compositions, for example, I was looking at, and the first thing I was thinking, well, how to what extent does that line track with the overall production?
Yes.
Going on? Is it over the top in terms of the overall production? Is it kind of standing out?
Yes.
And it made me think. Of course, you probably thought that's a stupid question to ask. But my question really is about then, given that this data is openly available, given that it can then be tied in other contexts, what contexts are you interested in that you could bring into this? Because you brought in, specific. If we look at the data, you've looked at plague. Is there value in trying to sort of put this data up against other economic factors? Well, what's happening here? Are there general trends you can tease out? And are there specific ones you've kind of thought of as that kind of next project kind of thing, throwing this against other radical contexts?
Yes, thank you. So with the Scottish music, I mean, it was interesting. We did compare it with the overall sort of graph of total number of music publications, and it was interesting. For instance, that in the 1830s didn't happen in the overall. Overall, it continues to rise. I think it would be, with the Scottish, it would be very interesting to contextualize that against maybe data that might relate to the sort of the relationship of England and Scotland in the Union, whether that is some kind of political timeline or some kind of thing of economic developments. And there probably aren't GDP figures from the 19th century, but some way to kind of contextualize how Scotland is becoming, these ties, political, economic, social, between the two nations. I think within the area of music, one of the most interesting linkages would be to link this bibliographic data with data relating to performances. So where is music being performed? Does that relate to where it's being published? And we did try or we had hoped to sort of do a bit of this, because one of the data sets we looked at was a data set called the concert programs database. But we geocoded all the data in that. So the concert programs database, some sort of tiny one at the bottom of here. But it would be really interesting to create to try and pushing alongside where is music being performed forms, and to see if there are similarities or whether music spreads more, as a performance than in a sort of published form. And then, I think it would be very interesting to map this alongside other bibliographical databases such as British National Bibliography and see if music is following sort of wider trends in printing. But we tried to do a bit of that with 16th and 17th century data for rise and fall of music printing, compare it to data from the Universal Short Title Catalogue for overall printed production. But we haven't really got to a stage of showing something that looks particularly clean for that. But I think, yeah, in general, it would be very interesting to try and map up music data with not just performance or bibliographic data in other fields, but maybe economic data, climate data, plague data. Are there sort of mortality rates, things to sort of expose the relationship between music and plague over the years? Because there's certainly many musical compositions which are associated with plague years, like 1680 in Hamburg. The musician Matthias Weckmann wrote these kind of desolate laments about how all the city is laid waste by the plague. So we know that plague had this big this big impact on the history of music through individual musical works. Can we trace that over a longer time frame, maybe looking at work done by medical historians or historians of population?
Any final questions? Well, in that case, I'd never thought before of the relationship between music and plague, but I thought that was fascinating. So before we close the live stream, I just want to say that the next Digital History Seminar is going to be on the 23rd of June, and it will be a joint seminar with the Archives and Society Seminar, and it will be on exploring big and small historical data sets and reflections on a couple of recent projects. I'm sure that will be a nice counterpoint to this particular discussion, but all that remains is to thank Stephen for a wonderful. Thank you.